Hello everyone and welcome to this latest video in the RICS Tech Partner Program series. My name is Andrew Knight. I've been with RICS for nearly 12 years now and I sit within our knowledge and practice area of the organisation. My role is to look at the overall effect of data and technology right across the built and natural environment, and with over 110,000 members working right across the property cycle through land, planning and development, construction, brokerage, valuation, finance, building operations, conveyancing, and indeed working across a whole host of asset types in terms of residential, commercial, alternative assets, land itself and infrastructure. Data and technology obviously has an incredibly important role to play now in digitising the sector, making our member firms more productive and indeed producing higher levels of service for the clients of our members. So today I'm really glad to have Helen Oakland join me today from mi-blox. So Helen, do please join me on the call.
Thank you, Andrew.
Great to have you on the call. And I always like to sort of start these calls before we get into the data and the tech itself with a bit of kind of the human side, so it'd be interesting to hear a bit about your backstory and the kind of origin story behind mi-blox.
Yes, so there are three of us in mi-blox, and we were all introduced by a mutual friend. We didn't know each other at all before mi-blox was set up, who he's a managing agent himself, and he was helping a lady who was having all sorts of problems with her building. And she, as a result of those issues with the freeholder, started to instigate the right to manage process in her building. She had a digital background and had the idea herself that it might be useful to see if something could be done to actually automate and sort of facilitate the application process with the right to manage. And that was sort of how we all got together. I have a legal background myself, and one of my other colleagues is the legal counsel in the organisation. And he knew that we both had property backgrounds and thought we'd be a good fit with our other colleague, Niall, who is the technical member, and he's got sort of 20+ years of experience delivering digital programs throughout various industries. So that was it. So we've been very lucky, really, because we've managed to form a great group of people who come from different angles, really, to make this, to set this up and make this work.
Great, and I know we're going to talk about right to manage in a bit of detail, but essentially, what is mi-blox doing? Is it around automating processes and paperwork? Is it that kind of platform for using data and tech in this kind of space?
Yes, that's exactly what it is, particularly with the first product, which is mi-RTM, which is the right to manage product. It's not a difficult application process, but you have to get it absolutely right. And we'll come on to this, I'm sure, a bit later on, but you can only really, as a freeholder, contest a right to manage application in certain situations, one of them being if a mistake has been made in the application process. And that can literally be as simple as not putting someone's middle name in, or perhaps using their maiden name where they've subsequently got married and their maiden name has been changed on the leasehold title, or something like that. So what our system does is it's streamlined and simplified the application process from the user's point of view. We do various things behind the scenes, but to make sure that no errors are made. It has therefore naturally become a lot more cost effective for the applicants than perhaps using a surveyor or a solicitor who might be charging an alley rate, for example.
Indeed. Now, working on the assumption that not all of our listeners will be familiar with the concept of right to manage, and I guess that's one of the challenges is almost awareness of this. Could you take us through what right to manage actually means from the basics, and also, thinking particularly about people who are listening perhaps in different parts of the UK and certainly outside the UK, which parts of the UK this applies in? Because obviously with the devolved nations, we have different regulations, and certainly in Scotland, obviously a very different legal system. So could you take us back to basics on what's right to manage, who's it for, what does it actually enable people to do?
You completely hit the nail on the head there, actually, Andrew, because one thing we have found is that although right to manage has been around for the best part of 20 years now, very few people know about it. And indeed, you find that you start talking about it and people think they know what you're talking about, and then sort of 5 minutes in, they realize that actually it's not quite what they thought. So one of the big challenges, exciting challenges that we face is that we need to, run an awareness campaign and create awareness of this ability. Fundamentally, what right to manage is it's a legal right that leaseholders in many buildings, not quite all, we can come on to that a bit later on, but many buildings have to take over the management of their building along with their fellow leaseholders. That means that they would be responsible for, running the maintenance of the building, procuring the insurance, working out the service charge, and prioritising what needs to be done in the building. That isn't to say that they have to actually physically do it all themselves, because obviously in larger buildings that's quite an endeavour. They can employ a managing agent to do it for them, but the advantage for them there is that the managing agent is accountable to them and not to their freeholder. And when you're the ones who are paying the service charge, you want to know that everything is being done to be as efficient as possible, particularly at the moment when obviously we've got costs increasing quite significantly. So in a nutshell, that is it really. The right to manage does not apply in Scotland, where there are different regulations, and one of the criteria is that it doesn't apply to buildings where the local authority is the freeholder.
All right.
There's a different system for that. So this is only for sort of privately owned freeholds.
And aside from almost a sense of control by the group of leaseholders, what other sort of benefits are you seeing flowing from right to manage?
Control is very much part of it. And there are two aspects there. There's the emotional control, in the sense that you're invested, it's your home, you're invested in your building, and you know that if you want the front tiles to be fixed because your mum tripped over them the other day, that actually is going to be prioritized, and you've got the power to do that by either organizing it yourselves, or probably more likely instructing your managing agent to do that. And then the other benefit is the financial benefit, because what you can find in a lot of buildings, understandably really, is that a managing agent is acting for the freeholder. The freeholder is perhaps running a large portfolio of properties, and they're not looking at every single penny that relates to a building in the way that someone who's getting the service charge bill landing on their doormat is, that people are sort of painfully aware at the moment of what everything costs. The other thing perhaps to mention in that regard is insurance. There was a recent FCA report actually just published a couple of months ago, which has come up with some statistics that were actually alarming even to me, and I've looked into it in the past in relation to the commissions paid on buildings insurance. What they found was that commissions of up to 60% are, exist and are quite common, and that the average commission paid on buildings insurance, I believe, was around 30%. That's obviously passed on to the people who pay the bill, namely the leaseholders. And although the commission would go to a broker, there is very sort of standard practice that the broker would share the commission with the building management.
Indeed.
They're not doing anything illegal there. It is something that happens, but obviously that's an alarming figure for a lot of people at the moment.
And I guess once again, there's probably a lack of awareness that that's going on, and therefore that's an additional fee. So I suppose an obvious question to make is can the freeholder object to this process? What sort of rights, if any, does the freeholder have over this concept?
Good question. The fundamental thing here is that it is a right that a leaseholder has, so the freeholder actually can't object. The only way that a freeholder can object is if there is a mistake in the application process, and that's where our platform comes in, because we ensure that there are no mistakes made. And also if you don't, as a building, meet the criteria for right to manage. This might be a good time actually to go through those, Andrew. The main criteria, as I said, you can't have a local authority as your landlord. You have to have 50% or more of the leaseholders in a building signed up as members of the process. You don't need 100% at all, and sometimes it's simply not possible to contact some people, if perhaps the landlord's overseas or something like that, and the building's the flat's tenanted. You can have right to manage in buildings where there's commercial space, but that commercial space can't amount to more than 25% of the building. So often you get buildings where perhaps there's a gym at the bottom, or a small supermarket or something, and that is absolutely fine. That 25%, things like parking spaces are not included in that. That is all counted as being residential. There is a small exemption where, with regard to some smaller buildings, actually not even all, where there are 4 flats or fewer and a freeholder owns a flat in that building and they or a close family member live in that flat. And then the final criteria is in relation to lease term, namely you need to have at least 2/3 of the flats need to be under leases that were 21 years or more when initially granted.
All right.
So again, if you perhaps have sort of, a section where you've got some sort of serviced apartments or something where perhaps they're on shorter leases, that might not work.
All right. Okay. But aside from that, the right exists, but just those
Aside
few
from that,
considerations to look at.
That's right.
So given it's been around a long time, I'm assuming that the kind of traditional way to do this has been for a group of leaseholders to work through a solicitor. So how does that process compare to what mi-blox has brought in terms of the automation? And I think, as you alluded to earlier, almost the kind of real pedantic issue of just making sure the application is entirely watertight in terms of dotting I's and crossing T's, to use that phrase.
Absolutely, yeah. The main advantage of my RTM, particularly sort of in the world we now live in, is that someone can sit at home as, normally there's a founder member, so you would have someone who's sitting there and they've just had enough of it and they decide this is what we need to do, and they might get their fellow leaseholders round for drinks if it's a fairly small building, or they might put notes through people's doors just to get the ball rolling. It's all, you can sit on your desktop or even on your phone or your iPad and start the process. You don't need to pay anything under my RTM until the building has been sort of certified as being qualified. So if you actually hadn't quite realised that the gym in the basement is 28% and not 25% or something like that, you won't find yourself paying fees at that point. And fundamentally, it is just a lot cheaper to use our platform. Perhaps worth pointing out at this stage, there are some buildings where there might be more complex issues. If you've got multiple blocks, for example, you are meant to, or you have to make an application per block. There might be shared facilities that muddy the waters. We, mi-blox run a fairly straightforward platform in that regard. And if we feel that some more sort of significant legal advice is needed, we can happily refer people onto specialists in the area who can help and perhaps come back to our platform if necessary, or perhaps take it away from the platform and sort of cross more T's and dot more I's.
And how does it feel from the perspective of somebody who perhaps achieves this and gets right to manage? How hard is it running a building now? I mean, do they need to set up bank accounts? How much time will they need to spend? And are there any kind of issues around transition in terms of if they move to a new management company with sinking funds that exist? I mean, what are the kind of challenges they're going to face, to be honest, doing this? Because they are going to take on a degree of work by, yes, they may appoint a new manager or perhaps inherit the existing one, but there must be some work that this group of residents will need to do now once they've got right to manage.
Yes, there is some work, and people should go into that with their eyes open, in the sense that you don't get anything for free in this life, and there is some responsibility that comes with it. We can help with the transition across to a new managing agent when we're independent, so we're not tied to any managing agent, which is you do find in the market there are a lot of managing agents, good managing agents out there, who will run the RTM process for buildings and then tie the building into them as managing agents going forward. That's certainly one model that's been very successful for a lot of people, but it does mean you are tied. We are independent. We can still recommend people to go to certain places and sort of get them up and running. As we develop our product, and we haven't done this as yet, but we are going to be developing a tool set to do exactly that, to help with the administrative side of things, so that you can take away the sort of more company secretarial side of the process, and in due course actually more sort of building manager tools. The group of leaseholders who are part of the RTM will need to have normally 2 people who are directors of the RTM company, who would take on the most responsibility, and they would be the ones who, on a, well, hopefully not day to day, but perhaps monthly time are dealing with the building manager. We certainly don't recommend that people manage buildings themselves unless they've got significant background in it. There are so many more rules and regulations now than there used to be. I used to manage a freeholder building myself, where I'm the freeholder, and I've handed it over actually, because although I know a lot about it, it's a very time-consuming process for one building where you can't benefit from the economies of scale that a managing agent can, for example. So I think, in short answer to your question, is yes, there is a there is a time investment in this, and you need to, you can't just expect for it all to happen, but the benefits for a large number of people very definitely outweigh the time spent.
Indeed. Well, it's a fascinating area, and I'll be very honest, I didn't know enough about it until we kind of decided to talk about it in this depth. So certainly from my perspective, I didn't have the awareness, and I'm sure we've been able to raise that awareness with many other people. Moving on to another aspect I know that you're looking at, I think you've got the concept you mentioned to me of a My Digital building. Can you tell me a bit more about that?
Yes, that's right. That is a digital repository for buildings of all sizes, actually, but which has come about because of the incoming golden thread legislation, which is going to be, well, the Building Safety Bill is obviously now becoming the Safety Act, but the legislation itself is going to be coming in, we believe, sometime next year. What My Digital building is, it is compliant, and we will develop it to make sure it is compliant with the things that haven't been elaborated on quite yet, with the requirements that buildings over 18 metres or 7 stories will have to maintain a digital record of effectively all this sort of core information and history of the building in relation to safety. And obviously, for post Grenfell, that's very much at the forefront of people's minds. And so it's in some ways a fairly simple product, in the sense that it is it's a digital filing system really, but it is totally compliant with the legislation, and will be developed as necessary to make sure that it remains compliant. It doesn't necessarily need to just apply to buildings that are over 18 metres. It's a useful management tool, actually.
Indeed, and I suppose to use some of the jargon that is sort of floating around the sector, it's that kind of concept of a building passport or logbook, where you're effectively building that kind of digital archive, and some of it may be documents. It may not all be structured data, I'm assuming, because there's a lot of things that still pass across a virtual desk as a PDF or a Word document or a certificate, rather than necessarily a database. I suppose people need to view this as a digital filing cabinet in some respects.
That's exactly what it is, in its most simple term. That is completely what it is, and particularly now when people are working from home a lot more, you can't walk to the physical filing cabinet in the way that you used to be able to, which simply might not be there. So even just as a sort of management tool in terms of accessibility, it is very useful.
So in addition to things like obviously the work you've done on Right to Manage and this My Digital building, what does the future look like for mi-blox in terms of other kind of processes that you support, or indeed these kind of archives? What obviously data around property isn't in a great state, is it, in classic terms? If you look at data needs for conveyancing, for the golden thread, for other use cases, rental, data is effectively on bits of paper in so many ways, isn't it? So what do you see as the future direction of mi-blox?
Yes, so we currently have these two products. The RTM product is completely up and running now. The My Digital building product is about to be launched, and from there we are hoping to build a couple of things. First thing, which I alluded to earlier on, I believe, was a tool set for building management, both in terms of the sort of documentation side, so the company secretarial side, all that sort of thing, and also the more practical day-to-day. I mean, our hope would be that we could build perhaps a marketplace for buildings in certain areas, connectivity between tenants and leaseholders in larger buildings, where we could perhaps have sort of promotions and attract services in, and advertise the local electricians and what might be useful for them, and that sort of thing. We're not there yet, but that's very much our aim, is so that once you've completed your RTM and you're using the digital repository, you're actually still part of a sort of a setup where, if it's useful to you, you could get some benefit from it.
Indeed, indeed. Well, it's been fascinating to talk this morning, Helen. I've certainly learned a lot myself about right to manage. I pride myself on knowing a lot of what goes on in the sector, but you can't keep up to date with everything, and it's a real challenge, I think, to get from the consumer perspective, the leaseholder perspective. I think awareness of this, that something's been around for so long. So once again, thanks for your time. Fascinating discussion, and I look forward to talking to you again, perhaps next year, with some news and update on what you're doing at mi-blox. But today, thanks very much for your help, Helen.
Absolutely. Thanks, Andrew. Thanks for your time.
Pleasure.